I've been making this series of videos on 7 insights from 7 historians on how to avoid a war between the United States and China. And the video I'm making today is a little bit different, but perhaps even the most important of those videos, because it goes to an issue that appears to be debated right now in my country about Australia's attitude towards the American alliance, Australia's attitude to the American security and military presence in the West Pacific, and the increasingly aggressive, really quite scary rhetoric coming from America, understandably, but extremely regrettably also from Australian elites, politics, in defence, in academia, and most appallingly of all, in journalism and media organisations that appear to be egging on a war with China. A catastrophic war, especially for Australia. And these in the Australian press this week, there has been a series of articles called Red Alert, very imaginatively, and they have been actively advocating that Australia prepare for war within China within 2 to 3 years, that Australia conscript people so that our population can get ready for military service, and that Australia adopt nuclear weapons. And all of this has also been going on in the midst of a debate within Australia about the sort of war powers legislation in Australia, with the current Australian government in lockstep with its main opposition party wanting to make that an exclusive legal privilege of the executive government and provide the elected representatives of the Australian Parliament no decision-making role in the decision to go to war. Scary in any time, but especially scary when journalists with a reputation for sidling up to leading politicians and promoting their careers should be out there in the media advocating actively an ideological war against China. The insight from the historian that I really wanted to share in this video to perhaps help move us on from this appalling situation in Australia, but it's a situation that I guess has been replicated across parts of the Western world. Certainly some of the rhetoric in America is, to my ears, astonishingly scary. Is this essay by Hugh White in perhaps it's sort of like it's in the quarterly essay for those of you who are not in Australia, is kind of the major sort of public debate essay in Australia, the one that tends to draw a lot of attention. And his essay is called Sleepwalk to War, Australia's Unthinking Alliance with America. And it was published around about August 2022, so about 6 months ago. And when it was published, I actually did a audio podcast 62 of episode 62 of the Burning Archive podcast, which I titled Australia's Role in a Multipolar World. Back then, I was still a government official, and I was a little bit circumspect, I guess, about how directly I would address some of the sort of rather contentious issues involved. But it is really quite an important essay to read. I think it's an illuminating essay for people outside of Australia to read, and the critical importance that it sort of highlights is that we can make choices now to mitigate the risk of war in Asia and war in Asia to defend American dominance in the world would be a catastrophe for the world. And Hugh White also contributed a article or essay in this book, Lessons from History, which is a collection of essays by Australian historians trying to illustrate how history can be practically used to help decision makers and policy makers in the present. And I also sort of talked about that book on the podcast around about the same time. But Hugh White's essay is, in fact, in here is entitled War with China, What Can History Teach Us? And he emphasizes that we should not trivialize the role of Australia in the sort of councils of war. I'm sure we're not overly influential, but we could play a moderate role, a moderating role that urges dialogue, diplomacy, and acceptance of the realities of the multipolar world. And here Hugh White actually refers to the quite significant role that Australian diplomacy played in the councils of war during World War II. And he said that really Australia's choices might help to shape the ultimate decisions for war or peace in Asia over the years ahead, make it all the more important that we weigh those decisions carefully. Absolutely. And that is such a profound insight. And he also emphasizes that, he says here, we would go to war with China to preserve the US strategic position in Asia on which we depend for our security. That is not quite the same as saying that we would fight to preserve our alliance with the United States. Many people assume that would be our primary objective because the US might abandon its commitments to us if we fail to support it. But Washington's disappointment with us does not threaten our US alliance nearly as gravely as Washington's defeat by China. As long as they have strategic ambitions in Asia, Washington will have good reasons to defend Australia, to help defend Australia. What would destroy the alliance would be the American defeat and withdrawal from Asia. And Hugh White in this essay makes a point that often very fateful decisions about war and peace, decisions to go to war and whatnot, are made on the basis of historical comparisons, often faulty historical comparisons. And for Australia, and in a way, much of the debate now around the Ukraine war makes the faulty comparisons with World War II. So you can see the analogy. And in Australia, the dominant idea is the sort of analogy with the British defeat in Singapore, which removed the British Empire as the principal defender of Australian interests in Asia. And in many ways, Australian foreign policy is dictated by this almost primal fear of America being defeated and withdrawing from Asia. And that, together with all the usual motives of people who sort of buy into the sort of American military industrial security complex, is perhaps one of the reasons why we're seeing this extraordinary cheerleading for war from some Australian policy elites at the moment, and even more shockingly, cheerleading from unimpressive, unelected, unaccountable journalists. So what I'm going to do in this video is actually play a edited cut down sort of version of my episode 62, episode 62 of the podcast, and then also looking at and just giving you the meat and bones of that episode that is 6 months later more relevant than ever. And it really talks about Australia's loyalty to USA dominance in Asia, how America could choose to abandon its unthinking allies, including Taiwan and Australia, or even Afghanistan, or potentially Ukraine. What are the elements of a more realistic Australian foreign policy in a multipolar world? The nature of this deep, historically grounded, but emotionally driven Australian elite fear of abandonment rooted in not necessarily valid historical interpretations of what happened in Singapore in 1942. And then after playing the audio component, which I'll have a little slide over, I'll come back for a brief little recap about this fear that that many people in Australia have, and I think the world should really know this, especially our potential closer ally, our potential partner in a multipolar diplomacy, India, that some Australian elites could well sign up Australia to the kind of disastrous course that has been pursued in Ukraine, where we become the site of a proxy war with China. Or if you've listened to the podcast already, you could also skip to the last couple of minutes of the video and I'll briefly talk about that issue and why it's so important, both within Australia, but also I think for people concerned about geopolitics and a multipolar world outside of Australia to realise the extent to which some of the elites in Australia seem to have lost the plot and are taking Australia on a path to disaster. So what I'm going to look at then in this podcast is I'm going to sort of set out Hugh White's argument about the situation and why Australia should not pursue an unthinking alliance with America that is about maintaining America's primacy in Asia, let alone its, unipolar status in the world. And then I'm going to talk about what his remedies are, his sort of what he describes as his action plan of courage and imagination. I'm going to give my own assessment of the strength of the historical thinking about Australia and, I guess, world history that is there in Hugh White's essay. And then I'm going to rise to the challenge that Hugh White puts out there that we should have a national conversation about Australia's place in an emerging multipolar world and put forward some 4 key themes of change for Australia's foreign policy. A different vision, if you like. Okay, so let's address those each in turn. And first of all, let's talk about the basics of Hugh White's argument in his quarterly essay. So if I were to summarise Hugh White's argument in a couple of sentences, it would be that he argues that Australia's foreign policy is too loyal to an American objective of American dominance in Asia, and that indeed that objective of America to be dominant in Asia is based in an unrealistic sense of global leadership that America itself should probably drop. And so consequently, Australia should rethink our strategy for a world that is a multipolar world, and in particular a world that in our region will have two large regional hegemons, China and India, both of which will be major great states in the world to come. And that also there are middle powers like us of Japan and Indonesia that can play a reasonable counterbalancing force to China that does not require American military and other sort of power projections into our region. And he argues ultimately America itself may come to realise this sooner than some of the Australian elites. It may come to realise that the costs of dominance in Asia for America vastly outweigh its real benefits, so that America is more likely to abandon Asia and Australia in terms of its security before Australia abandons America. He begins the essay with some few observations on the remarkable negative turn in relationships between China and Australia over the last 5 to 10 years. For the longest time, China was, celebrated in Australia and embraced in Australia, with a lot of focus on both the welcome climb of China out of poverty and lowly status, as well as the economic benefits to Australia of the vast expansion of the market and its role as Australia's major trading partner. But America has also always been, or at least since World War II, has been Australia's security partner. Not just partner, but its dominant partner. And for the longest time, Australians would say, well, we don't really need to choose between America and Australia. But over the last few years, that position has changed. And as American attitudes towards China across the political spectrum in America have hardened, so the pressure, on the Australian political leadership to back America and to, if need be, fight China has grown. And Hugh White argues that there has really been a bipartisan consensus in Australia that we can rely on and are dependent on America to manage our relations with China. This, he says, reflects habit and timidity, but also an immense faith in American power and resolve. But that faith is not necessarily substantiated by the facts. As I described in my podcast last time, there's increasing doubts around the world about whether America will break. And Hugh White similarly wonders whether, in the end, our ally will probably fail us. He argues we should learn from the Singapore crisis of 1941 and 42, the previous time when a dominant ally failed us. And similarly, we should learn from the failure of diplomacy and statecraft in the 1930s. To quote Hugh White, he says, what we should learn is the need to think a lot more carefully about the problems we face with China, how realistic it is to rely on America to solve them, and what we can do instead. We should do our due diligence and decide for ourselves if what Washington is saying or doing really stacks up and makes sense. And the closer we look, the worse things appear. And they are particularly bad because China and America are locked into a contest over which of those great states will be, in Hugh White's words, the primary strategic power in East Asia and the Western Pacific in the decades ahead. America wants to keep its dominant role in Asia, if you like, Obama's pivot to Asia, in order to maintain its primacy in the world. And China wants to push America out of its region, out indeed of the China Sea, in order to assert equal status with America and its role as the regional hegemon. But Hugh White really doubts whether America can summon the domestic political support for fighting the wars or paying the costs of that dominance in Asia. It is, after all, a long way from home, and without secure domestic support for the costs of war, America is unlikely to be able to compete effectively with China. And that's why Hugh White says that for Australia, the key choice we face is not whether we should abandon America, but whether we should trust them, that is America, not to abandon Asia, to abandon us. And there are a couple of key examples he gives around this. First of all is the test of Taiwan. Now, White argues that Taiwan is a test of both American and Australian foreign policy, and that it is, I guess, the lightning rod of conflict between America and China. If China succeeds in its aim to push America out of Taiwan and out of it will succeed in removing America's dominance in the West Pacific, or a large part of that. And potentially both America and China are prepared to go to war over it, certainly to make significant postures towards each side, or gestures towards each side over this issue that could come to a crisis at any point. And as I'm recording this podcast, there's a debate over whether the Speaker of the House of Representatives in America, Nancy Pelosi, should visit Taiwan, given the clearly stated concerns of China that this would compromise America's commitment to the One China policy and, if you like, would cross a red line with China. It's likely to be the key point, as in the broad issue of Taiwan, that Xi Jinping will raise with Joe Biden. And as he has said before, as Xi Jinping has said before to Joe Biden, I meet with you and you tell me one thing and then your government goes and does something else. How can I really trust you? One wonders what will happen in that conversation. Perhaps we will report that. Perhaps I will report that on the Burning Archive in a later episode. But there are a couple of key things Hugh White says are important to consider about the willingness of both sides to go to war over China. China knows that America accepts, if ambiguously, and that international law backs China's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. Taiwan has a different status, for example, than Ukraine in the United Nations and so forth. America has also long maintained strategic ambiguity over Taiwan. It gives the sense that maybe it would fight over Taiwan, but then maybe it wouldn't. And that muddying of the waters enables it to maintain a certain posture without provoking China too far. But it is also perhaps bluffing over a rather poor hand. Would America really have any chance in a fight over Taiwan? And that is the last key point in the assessment of the willingness of both parties to go to war over Taiwan. If there were a conflict over Taiwan, it would quickly escalate into a major war in the Pacific between America and China. Hugh White says it would be likely that America might bomb, military or civilian targets in the Chinese mainland, and that it would be highly likely for China similarly to bomb Guam. And the risk of nuclear conflict also cannot be ruled out. Moreover, it's a war that America would be likely to lose, given China would very quickly be able to assert dominance over land and air and sea in Taiwan, given it's right next door. This is what Hugh White describes as the Taiwan test. And he says it is the heart of the whole question of America's future in Asia and the wisdom of Australia's dependence upon it. Australia, he says, should really free itself of the myth of American invincibility. It needs to acknowledge the Chinese capacity to control air and sea around Taiwan, and so to control any war. And it needs to accept the reality that such a war is likely to escalate quickly, involve sinking aircraft carriers and bombing US bases, even potentially Australian targets, and that a few submarines sent from Australia in the 2040s is unlikely to affect that conflict. In essence, he says America has no clear and plausible path to victory in a war over Taiwan, and hence, if it cannot win a war with Taiwan, should it continue to push diplomatic conflicts over Taiwan, can it really continue to assert its use of Taiwan as the world's largest aircraft carrier, which was, I think, how General Douglas MacArthur described Taiwan, as can it continue to claim that part of China for its own geostrategic purposes? White argues that China ultimately has the greater strategic will to claim Taiwan, and that therefore it is more likely to roll the dice on Taiwan and so confront America with a choice of either withdrawing from its dominant position in the West Pacific or fighting a war that they would lose and still lose their dominance in the West Pacific. The ultimate bad choice. That is why Hugh White argues wiser heads should call for a dignified exit from the West Pacific and Asia by America. But for Hugh White, the acme of foreign policy failure, I guess, has been the AUKUS alliance, and Australia's recent foreign policy in Asia, with its loud noise on behalf of the Quad and American interests, and in particular the decision under AUKUS to order nuclear-powered submarines from the United Kingdom. He is absolutely devastatingly critical of this AUKUS decision, and it's well worth reading the essay, if for nothing else for that. He says, all this, the complacency, the incompetence, the illusions, came together in the proposal to acquire nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS. I'm not going to go into all the detail about the nuclear-powered submarines, but he basically says it is one of the most appalling decisions in Australian defence foreign policy. In the annals of defence policy failure, it is hard to recall anything more absurd than this whole sad mess. I do recommend listeners to the Burning Archive to read that essay. But he is highly critical not only of that, but also of the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific that Australia uses, and Australia's recent rather narrow perspective on diplomacy on behalf of America and the rules-based order, and approaching India largely through the Quad rather than India's broader significance. He is, devastatingly critical of how Australia has pursued foreign policy as a loyal ally, an unthinking ally to America in recent times, rather than through as a genuinely significant regional middle power that can pursue its own interests and adapt to the realities of the geopolitical environment that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to turn now to what Hugh White describes as his action plan for courage and imagination, which is, if you like, a set of proposals for a more realistic foreign policy for Australia that is adapted to the multipolar world that we find ourselves in. And he says there are 6 broad points to this action plan. First of all, he says that we need to get real about the situation we face. There's no point talking about overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party in China, or of, fighting for democracy rather than autocracy in Eurasia. The China we see now is the China we must learn to live with. And similarly, there's no point pining or flattering America that it is still the indispensable nation, even though Australian political leaders seem addicted to that same flattery. There are reasonable doubts about America's capacity to prevail in Asia, and to put those views is not irrational anti-Americanism, but clear-eyed realism. And that is what the first point of his action plan is, to face the world as it is, not as the West Wing presented it to us in our youth. The second point is that we need to build a more balanced and realistic view of China. We're not facing the extreme scenarios of an American takeover of China, or of China ruling the world and taking over America. Rather, Hugh White says we should plan for some more likely plausible outcomes in between those extremes. And that may well be that China will not aspire to rule the world, to dominate and impose its political system on the entire globe, that it may well be content with its own country and a role as a regional hegemon and a powerful, decisive state in a different multilateral world order. China will turn out to be a regional hegemon we can learn to live with, if never to like much, let alone love, and build a policy towards that. And Hugh White there may be reflecting the generally pro-American stance of a lot of the Australian intelligence world, because I'm sure there is quite a lot of affection for Chinese culture in Australia as well. Inflated threats lead to costly, disastrous policies. Witness Russia and Europe and the war on terror, and hence having a balanced and realistic view of the major country which we are turning into an enemy is a central plank of a better foreign policy, according to Hugh White. Thirdly, he says we should think seriously about the nature of a war between China and America so we can make realistic decisions about if and how to be involved. Empty rhetoric about, going to war over Taiwan to protect democracy is all very well, but the reality that he describes is that it will be a devastating and ugly event if there is a war between China and America, and it may well be an event in which nuclear weapons are deployed. We do not want to do that. We should be cautioning against it. And this is the fourth major and most interesting point about Hugh White's action plan for imagination and courage in Australian foreign policy. He says we should talk to America about its future in Asia and our role in sustaining it. Ultimately, he says America cannot sustain its dominance in Asia without risking nuclear war, so it had better abandon Taiwan and accept a diminished role in Asia and a more equal partner status in a multilateral world order. Australia can tell America that Australia does not support America conducting a war over Taiwan, that Australia and the other important great powers and middle powers of Eurasia, or the coast of Eurasia, have an interest in saying to America, we're grateful for what you've done, but you don't need to keep doing it. Fifthly, he says we should recast our diplomacy in Asia. By being the deputy sheriff of America in Asia, by twisting India's arm to join the Quad, to just be part of America's counterbalancing of China, we are neglecting relationships and misunderstanding the emerging situation in Asian geopolitics. And in particular, he focuses on India's growing role as a great state and its importance in realistically being a competitor with China itself in the great so-called Indo-Pacific. India will continue to want to be a regional hegemon in its region. Indeed, Hugh White says it may well be that India will wish to be a regional hegemon over Australia as much as China does. And perhaps that is not such a bad regional hegemon to have, I would have thought. Maybe there is a great cultural and increasingly, demographic affinity between India and Australia that we might develop further. Similarly, we need to think differently about our relationship with Indonesia and to think differently about Japan and perhaps Japan's complex set of attitudes towards both America and China. The world is not necessarily going to remain as it was in the post-World War II era. Sixth, he says we should start talking to China. And it does seem perhaps that conversation has restarted in recent times, but we need to not view our relationship with China through the prism of America's interests. We should pursue our relationship with China as it is and as we find it. And then the seventh final point of his action plan for imagination and courage in Australian foreign policy is that Australians themselves need to have a national conversation about the change in the geopolitical environment. As I said at the start of the program, Hugh White rightly sees all these changes, the rise of China, the decline of America, the rise of India, the growth of Indonesia, the increasing power of Russia, as amongst the most significant changes, well, the most significant change in the geopolitical environment since 1788, since white settlement in Australia. And it is perhaps a not dissimilar point to the point I've raised before about the end of the Anglo-American imperial dominance in the world. We are seeing the fall of a 300-year period of Anglo-American dominance in the world, and we need to have an important conversation in Australia about just what that means for us. Indeed, Hugh White imagines or writes it should not be too hard to draft a speech along these lines that sets out the challenges for Australia if we could only find a political leader willing to deliver it. Well, at least Hugh White's found at least one podcaster prepared to at least discuss it. So let's talk about what I make of Hugh White's use of history in his arguments. So there are really sort of three observations I wanted to make about Hugh White's use of historical arguments in his quarterly essay. First of all, he uses the important trope of the abandonment of Australia by the British Empire in the fall of Singapore. And again, I addressed this in an earlier podcast, which perhaps listeners might want to look back on, episode number 18, After Kabul, the task ahead for Australia. But it is fundamental to Hugh White's argument that he is pulling on the emotional heartstrings of the strategic elite in Australia about the risk of being abandoned by our great and powerful friends. As Britain failed to look after us, our security appropriately in America, in Singapore, and did not or could not afford to defend against the Japanese Empire as it was being attacked by Germany. So Hugh White raises the spectre that America may, with its global commitments crisis, no longer be able to sustain its overcommitment in Asia. And I guess this is it's a very effective historical argument, but it is one of the, what particularly overseas listeners to the Booting Archive podcast need to understand the absolute resonance of this metaphor in Australian strategic thinking circles. It's like the fall of Saigon, I guess, in America. Secondly, Hugh White acknowledges what he calls the need for a new YOTA, a new world peace agreement to redefine security in Europe and Russia, and the same in the West Pacific. He argues there really is a need for a set of agreements that settle the post-Cold War international order. And listeners to the podcast might remember my arguments during my various episodes on Ukraine about how since the Cold War, there has not really been, since the end of the Cold War in 1989, there hasn't really been a proper peace negotiated for the New World Order. There has just been an assumed liberal rules-based order in which America prevails and America's will prevails. But Hugh White says that the conflicts in Ukraine and in Taiwan cannot be settled without this broader vision of a new set of multilateral international institutions and the failure of Western leaders to seriously think about doing that has underpinned the conflict in Ukraine. He says 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Europe needs a new Yalta being the major peace agreement struck between Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin in the latter part of the war that set out the arrangements for the post-World War II era. So Europe needs a new Yalta to agree the terms of Russia's place in Europe and relations with America in the post-Soviet era. Just as in East Asia, we need to agree new terms for China's place in the region and its relations with America in the era of Chinese power. If we cling to the idea of the American century, the liberal rules-based order, we are ultimately clinging, Hugh White says, to an old and unsustainable vision of order that's unrelated to the realities of power and culture and geography today. Thirdly, Hugh White brings an appropriate level of historical skepticism towards the conjuring up of the idea of a Eurasian colossus by some American geostrategic thinkers, such as Mike Pompeo, who I think I quoted along those lines in the previous program. The extreme case scenario that American thinkers bring up is that China combined with Russia, but China being dominant, will form a unified Eurasian colossus. And as with Halford Mackinder, he who rules the world island of Eurasia will rule the world. But Hugh White acknowledges that although there have been many aspirants to rule the world, in the realities of complex power, imperial rivalry, cultural dynamics, has always meant this has been a failed ambition rather than a realized goal. And hence the grandeur of grand strategies who turn Eurasia into a chessboard to be manipulated by the new masters of the universe always fails. And in a way, there is a kind of acknowledgement here of the great work by John Darwin after Tamerlan, which I really shall do an episode on before too long, which talks about the shadow of Tamerlan's failure, the ongoing failure of a single power to dominate Eurasia, despite the fantasies of Halford Mackinder in the early 20th century. That adage that he who rules the world island rules the world should really be retired, and we should think about what Halford Mackinder says, what Hugh White says is a multipolar global order in which a number of great powers, each with its own sphere of influence, compete and cooperate. And in our region, the two most important ones are India and China, followed perhaps then by Indonesia and Japan, as well as the Southeast Asian nations. So as I conclude that podcast, as I concluded that podcast in August 2022, there was some additional stuff I had in the audio podcast that you can check out if you like as well. But it's basically talking about Australia moving on from this ridiculous American rhetoric about the unipolar world and the United Nations of democracies and all the rest of it. and accepting the fact that the multipolar world is here and we need to move on to a mature diplomacy where there are multiple significant medium and other powers in the world, that America does not dictate how things are going. But the set of articles in the Australian press, in the, I think it's called the Nine Media, as a Channel 9 News, including two major papers, the Sydney Morning Herald, which is based in Sydney, obviously, and The Age, which is based in Melbourne, but they're run by the same media organisation. They both covered the same stories, has been the most extraordinary piece of, well, I think it's probably fair to call it a pro-American propaganda operation to try to lock us behind this sort of militant current American foreign policy approach of reasserting the unipolar world. And perhaps the most articulate, forceful, powerful, and significant responses to that has come from the former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, has certainly stood apart from the current craze within Australian elites to be exceedingly pro-American. And he has published a piece on John Menadew's Pearls and Irritations, where my article on the Grand Illusions of the Western Ukraine was also published, where he describes the Sydney Morning Herald's prominent series of provocations urging Australia into a war with China, concluded its third instalment today. At item 20 of its presentation, apart from its advocacy of the introduction of compulsory national service, it wantonly urges that Australia should further consider basing long-range missiles armed with nuclear weapons on Australian territory, and goes on to say, if the US were interested in doing so, we appear to be wanting, these are my words, to replay the Ukraine story. And Paul Keating comments that there is no threat from China in any strategic sense, but these people, these journalists, etc., seem to want to urge war on China. And it is something of a concern, I think, that one of the key journalists, Peter Harcher, who Paul Keating singles out for particular criticism, has long been, during the Kevin Rudd years, was closely associated with Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd, our former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, who has recently been appointed the Australian Ambassador to the United States. I think he's also has been the president of the Asia Society, certainly presents himself in the United States to people like Condoleezza Rice and co. as, the China whisperer of Australia, but was generally pretty inept in his diplomacy with China in his years in office. So people around the world should realise that people within Australia don't have quite as high an assessment of Kevin Rudd's capacity to help us navigate through a multipolar world as people in America might. And what Paul Keating says towards the end of this article is, it is exceptionally important that the readership of these two capital city newspapers understands that the papers and their editors are urging war with China over, of all things, Taiwan, an island off the Chinese coast, an island Australia does not recognise as an independent state and has never recognised as an independent state, and a war employing nuclear weapons, with the absurd assumption that were Chinese assets to be attacked with nuclear weapons, the Chinese would not similarly attack Australia employing the same weapons. In such a wicked scenario, how would the Herald and the Age report Chinese reprisals against Australia as nuclear weapons smash into Australian targets? But this is the game the fool Peter Harcher has urged the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age to be in. God help us. Indeed, God help Australia. God help the world. We all need to wise up to the extraordinarily bad leadership and diplomacy of the world coming out from America and its closest allies at the moment, and the extraordinary bad history that they are retailing, and the dangerous level of propaganda that they also seem to be pushing out through the media channels they control. The only thing we can do about it is to take control of our own minds, to not see other nations, other great cultures and civilizations in the cliched, propagandistic terms that the sort of American propaganda machine is generating, and to try to find our way back to dialogue and diplomacy in the multipolar world that now exists. Perhaps we should take our lead from China's brokering of peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and make that Australian pivot to India that I have previously spoken about. Okay, so a bit of a longer video this week with the extra content from my pod and the level of alarm really that there is going on there. And I will see you again soon in my next video.